Tomorrow evening marks the 11th annual installment of the Game Awards. What started in 2014 as a relatively small show for recognizing the best games of the year has grown over time into the biggest event in gaming. Last year, the viewership of the show reportedly grew to over 100 million people. I've been watching the Game Awards year in and year out since its early days, and tomorrow will be no different. I will be watching the Game Awards in their entirety. But I'm not looking forward to it, because the Game Awards are awful. The show simply does not work as a show for awarding games. If you've clicked on this video, you're probably expecting that you're only going to get one problem with the Game Awards, but I'm actually going to give you 3 problems for the price of 1. And the 3 problems are as follows. Number 1, it is not a show for awarding games, it is a show for announcing games. Number 2, the show reliably showers awards on big name games and studios, many of which have favorable relationships with the show. Number 3, the show is controlled way too much by the whims of its creator, Geoff Keighley. We have a lot of ground to cover here, so let's start with problem number 1. Problem 1, the Game Awards show is not a show for awarding games. It is a show for announcing games. If you know anything about the Game Awards, you know that there's a specific comparison that gets brought up constantly. The Academy Awards for Film, also known as the Oscars. The Game Awards website featured links to 2 separate articles that each describe the Game Awards as the Oscars for gaming. And if you showed a random person a few clips from each show, they would probably tell you that the 2 shows seem pretty similar. But there's a huge difference between the shows that comes across very quickly if you watch them in full. The Oscars are about celebrating movies from the past year, and the Game Awards are about building hype for future games. Now I want to be clear that I'm not here to tell you that the Oscars are a perfect awards show. Later on in this video, I'm actually going to talk about why they're not. But one thing you can say about the Oscars is that the show reliably carries out its intended purpose, which is to say, the show is about giving out awards for movies. When people talk about the Oscars, usually the conversations are about the awards. Who won the awards, who should have won the awards, and who gave weird speeches while they were accepting the awards. The Game Awards are a different story. Surprisingly for a show called the Game Awards, the act of giving awards to games is mostly treated like an afterthought. Here's a clip of host Geoff Keighley announcing some awards at the 2023 Game Awards. Tell me if anything stands out to you.
Here are the nominees for Best VR AR. Gran Turismo 7, Humanity, Horizon Call of the Mountain, Resident Evil Village VR Mode, and Synapse. And the Game Award goes to Resident Evil Village VR Mode. Congratulations to Capcom. Now your nominees for Best Mobile Game.
Now what we have here is the host of a show called the Game Awards reading through the awards for games like they're legal disclaimers in a commercial for high blood pressure medication. I went through the 2023 Game Awards and manually tracked how much of the show focused on giving awards to games. And so while this number might not be precise to the exact second, based on my tracking, we got about 38 minutes of awards for games across a 3-hour-long show. When you watch the Game Awards live and you don't know what's coming next, it definitely feels like there's a big emphasis on trailers, but in rewatching the show, I was really shocked at how big the tilt is. What jumped out at me on rewatching the show is how much time passes between awards. The 2023 Game Awards main show starts out by awarding the winner for Best Performance, and then 23 minutes pass until the next award. Then after that, it's about 14 minutes until the next award is given out. Then after that, 11 minutes before we get to the clip I showed earlier of Geoff reading Game Awards like he's selling them at an auction. By the time we reach the first hour of the show, we've spent maybe 10 minutes of that hour giving out awards to games.
I know I don't have much time.
In total, there were 24 Game Awards giving out during the 2023 Game Awards main show, with a few other awards being covered in the half-hour opening act segment. And I think the show's lack of interest in awarding games is also reflected in a big way by the limited number of award categories. Here's the list of awards being given out at this year's show. It's not a bad list by any means, but it also doesn't cover a lot of different genres and subgenres of games. Also, since most awards only get 5 nominees, every year you end up with weird games being chosen to go head-to-head, like in 2021 when you had Age of Empires 4 and Microsoft Flight Simulator both competing for Best Sim/Strategy Game. To me, this problem almost seems like it's by design. If you add more awards, that's more time being spent on awards, which means you either have to make the show longer or spend less time on advertisements.
Congratulations, Neil. Great speech. And short, so thank you.
Just as a thought experiment, I tried to come up with my own list of awards to see if I could come up with categories that would represent a wider range of games. I don't think my list is perfect either, but I think the categories here would at least account for the majority of games coming out in a year. If you have other ideas for award categories, leave a comment. One thing I considered as I was doing this was making a long list of separate categories for independent games, because these games tend to be pretty underrepresented at the Game Awards. But I realized that making a separate list of awards for independent games basically means you're saying that those games don't deserve to be in the main awards group, which is an outlook I don't agree with at all. And that brings me to problem number 2. Problem 2. The Game Awards reliably shower awards on big budget games, many of which have a friendly relationship with the show. The Game Awards has a big tilt towards nominating and awarding games that are developed by AAA developers. To illustrate this point, I took some time to go over data from the 2023 Game Awards. The companies you see listed here are on the board for the Game Awards, which means that they're are involved in the production of the show. The Game Awards website doesn't specify exactly how these companies are involved in the show, but the website is adamant that these companies don't get any special treatment just because they're on the board. If you know anything about video games, one thing that's going to jump out to you immediately about this list is that it's made up of all the biggest companies in gaming. If you were going to make a list of the most successful game developers in the world right now, this would pretty much be the list. When I began doing my research for this video, I had the suspicion that games developed by the companies you see here might be overrepresented in the awards given out. Having looked over the data, I would say the results on that front actually weren't as bad as I expected. But after going over it a little bit more, I realized that the skew isn't so much towards these companies as it is towards AAA developers in general. Here's a list of the 24 awards given out at the Game Awards that are specifically focused on awarding games and developers. I've excluded awards like Best Content Creator from this list because I'm only interested in awards that are given to games and game developers. For the same reason, we're excluding Best Adaptation from this list because it's for TV and movies, and I cut out the Player's Choice Award since that one's based on a fan vote. I'm also going to remove the Innovation in Accessibility Award because it's voted on by a separate panel that are more attuned to accessibility in gaming, and because it does make sense that AAA developers have more resources to implement these sorts of features. Now we're down to 24 awards, and I'm just going to remove 4 more. Best Indie, Best Debut Indie, Games for Impact, and the Best Mobile Game. Best Indie and Best Debut Indie are awards which AAA games explicitly cannot win, although even that point can be argued. Games for Impact is not explicitly limited to indie games, but its nominees usually are. And finally, I've removed the Mobile Game Award just because mobile games exist in what's basically a completely different ecosystem than traditional console games. That leaves us with 20 categories, all of which are focused on games and game developers, and all of which are not specifically designed to exclude AAA games. Let's start by taking a look at how companies on the board of the Game Awards did in terms of awards. Of these 20 awards, the board companies you see here came away with 9 of them. Alan Wake 2 was published by Epic Games and got 3 awards. Hi-Fi Rush was published under Bethesda and got an award. Nintendo walked away with 3 different awards for 3 different games. Forza Motorsport brought home an award for Xbox, and Valorant, nominated for the very hard to quantify Best Esports Game Award, gets an award for Riot Games. That gives us 9 awards awarded to sponsors of the show and 11 awards given to other companies. Now let's set aside the winners and look at the games which were nominated for these awards but did not win them. For each category, we have 4 or 5 nominees that didn't end up winning, totaling 82 runner-up nominations across these 20 awards. Of these 82 runner-up nominations, 42 of them went to companies on the board. So basically what we find is that just under half the winners at the Game Awards were published by companies involved in the production of the show, and just over half of the losing nominees were produced by those same companies. Now obviously the fact that roughly half of the games featured at the award show were made by companies that helped produce the award show is not a great look, but even still, I don't think these numbers should automatically be seen as damning. If we want to take a more charitable view of this information, it is certainly fair to say that the companies you see here publish so many games from so many smaller developers, it might make sense a lot of their games show up on this list. But now let's dig a little deeper into the results for companies that aren't part of the Game Awards board. Here are the 11 award winners that are not on the board for the show. Obviously, Larian Studios cleaned house with Baldur's Gate 3, but what's interesting to me here is that every studio not named Larian Studios on this list is a high-profile AAA developer. And you could probably make the case that Larian should be counted as a AAA developer, but I'm not painting them with that brush just because at least prior to 2023, they existed in a completely different stratosphere than the other companies that won awards here. Now let's revisit our list of runner-up nominations. 42 of the 82 runner-up nominees were developed by companies on the Game Awards board. And for the 40 runner-up nominees not made by companies on the board, 18 of those 40 losing nominations went to the developers you see here, all of whom would be considered top-end AAA developers in gaming. The last 22 nominations went to these companies, the majority of whom only got 1 nomination. Again, what jumps out about this list is how many of these runner-ups came from AAA developers. If we combine the list of AAA winners with the list of AAA nominees, what we find is pretty striking. Out of the 102 nominations given out for these 20 awards, 75 of the 102 went to these 16 AAA developers. As for the award winners, 15 of the 20 awards went to this shorter list of companies who are, again, all members of the board and or top AAA developers in gaming. The 5 awards that didn't go to the companies on this list all went to Larian Studios for Baldur's Gate 3. What does this tell us? Well, if you're an indie developer at the Game Awards and one of your games is up for a non-indie specific award, it's probably best to not get your hopes up too much. For the 2023 Game Awards, I did some pretty extensive number crunching to come up with these results. And while I didn't do this same level of analysis for previous years of the show, if you take my list of favorites AAA developers and look over previous year's winners, you notice pretty quickly how heavily the show skews towards games developed by these companies. As a matter of fact, Baldur's Gate 3 was the first game to win Game of the Year at the Game Awards that wasn't published by one of these companies. Dig a little further and you see that over the past 10 years of the Game Awards, 47 out of 56 games nominated for Game of the Year were published and or developed by these companies. Only 9 times in the 10-year history of the Game Awards to date has a game from any other company been given a shot. Inside in 2016, Persona 5 and PUBG in 2017, Celeste in 2018, Control and The Outer Worlds in 2019, Hades in 2020, and Plague Tale Requiem and Stray in 2022. And when you consider how the voting for the Game Awards tends to go, how many of these games would you say actually even had a chance to win the award? Maybe Persona 5 and Hades, both of which had pretty significant mainstream hype. Celeste is one of my all-time favorite games, and I really love Inside as well, but based on all the data we have here, I really struggle to imagine a 2D platformer winning Game of the Year. Among the 2024 nominees for Game of the Year, I would probably say Balatro is the game I've enjoyed the most, but I can't say I really think it has any shot of winning. But I could be very wrong about this tomorrow. I really hope I am. There are a few other more subtle ways in which the Game Awards tilts its results towards AAA games as well. Like I said earlier, the Best Esports Game Award feels like a pretty hard thing to quantify, but every year this award basically nominates the same 5 or 6 games, all of which come from big-name developers. Last year, the award for Best Ongoing Game was given to Cyberpunk 2077, a game which was really only ongoing in the sense that it was borderline unplayable at launch and required several ongoing years of development after its release to fix it. Even if your game faceplants on launch, the Game Awards show is more than willing to help you retroactively clean up your game's reputation. The Game Awards website provides a list of gaming news outlets that vote on its awards, but it doesn't really provide specifics on who votes for each award or what process each outlet has for their voting. And this is a problem that's kind of the fault of the fans. Considering how mad people online get if you don't give a game the review they want it to get, I completely understand the decision to not name any names when it comes to voting on these awards. At the same time, I worry about how this process tilts the Game Awards towards just favoring the games that the most reviewers played, which also tend to be the games published by big developers. If 20 people at your gaming website played Elden Ring and 2 people played Balatro, I don't know how Balatro has any chance of winning. As it stands, we really have no context for why voters for the Game Awards choose one game over the other. I would love a system for the Game Awards that was more like the annual NBA Player Awards, where we get some insight into how voters ranked each game relative to each other, and voters can discuss publicly why they chose one game over another. I mentioned before that the Game Awards website discusses how the host of the show and the show's board members don't influence the award winners, and in fairness, I would be shocked if Geoff or these companies were literally telling these voters which games to pick. If something like that was happening, I think we would have heard about it. But the 2 things I think are more plausible are that the structure of the show probably leads to more AAA games getting in the door with nominations, and that whoever selects the voting panel for the awards might tend to select voters who share their view of what games deserve these awards. This brings us to the third and final problem with the Game Awards. Problem 3. Founder and host of the Game Awards, Geoff Keighley. Who is Geoff Keighley? According to his LinkedIn, he's the CEO of the Game Awards Incorporated. According to his own website, he's one of the leading media entrepreneurs in the video game industry. Geoff Keighley has been involved in video game awards shows for longer than some of you watching this video have been alive. He spent over a decade with Spike TV producing their annual Game Awards show, which was somehow even worse than the Game Awards. In 2014, as Spike TV folded its Game Awards show, and ultimately their entire brand, Geoff Keighley saw an opportunity. He scrounged together the cash to create his own Game Awards show, one which could be shaped entirely in his own image. And that's how we ended up in the predicament we're in today. Before I go any farther, I want to pause and say that my goal in making this video is not to tear apart Geoff Keighley. I'll be honest with you that when I began to do my research for this video, I came into the project with what I would say is not the most positive outlook on Geoff, largely because of how much I've been frustrated by the Game Awards over the years. If you're familiar with gaming media, you know the memes about Geoff. He's the Dorito Pope. He's the guy who hypes up games that look like this. But to be honest with you, as I did more research on Geoff Keighley's career, I walked away from it with a more favorable view of him than I began with. When you read about Geoff's career, it becomes clear that he has a real skill for getting game developers to open up to him. Is he the best writer? No. Are his jokes funny? I don't really think so. Did he open the piece about the launch of Half-Life 2 by comparing it to the early days of the Iraq War? He did, but in fairness, I've read crazier things on gaming blogs. My point in saying all this is to say that I don't think Geoff is a bad guy. If he's guilty of anything, it's liking big companies too much and taking himself too seriously. So what does all this have to do with the Game Awards? Well, let's come back to the Oscars for a moment. Remember when we talked about how often the Game Awards end up getting compared to the Oscars? Well, it turns out there's a reason why that comparison keeps coming up. Geoff Keighley's parents are both long-standing executives for IMAX. In a 2022 interview with The Ringer, Geoff shared that as a young man, it stood out to him how much his parents, quote, revered the Oscars. He's quoted in the article as follows: "My dad would always talk about the Oscars and how much it meant to him. I always wondered, well, why doesn't games have something that people care about that much? What's the Oscar equivalent for gaming?" Creating a gaming equivalent of the Oscars has been a goal for Geoff since the 1990s. and I genuinely think he deserves credit for making his dream into something real. How many of us can say the same thing for our own wildest dreams? Geoff spent decades in the gaming media world building up to this moment. Far be it from me to yuck another man's yum. So the problem is not that Geoff Keighley has dedicated himself so much to a single goal. The problem is that I personally don't think the goal he chose is a great one to dedicate your life to. Let me ask you this question. What are the major problems with the Oscars? If you ask any of your cinephile friends, they'll tell you that the issue with the Oscars is that the Oscars tend to reward certain kinds of movies more than others. The voters for the Oscars like movies about Hollywood. They like movies about war. They like period pieces. They like movies about emotional melodrama and the quote-unquote relevant political themes. Everyone in the world knows what kinds of movies the Academy likes, to the point that there's a term for movies that try to exploit these preferences: Oscar bait. And so at the end of the day, the Oscars isn't really a show for awarding the best movies. It's a show for awarding movies that do the best job of meeting the unspoken criteria of the Oscars. Now, there are plenty of times where the movies that win at the Academy Awards are genuinely great movies worthy of recognition. And the question of how you decide which movies are better than other movies is a philosophical quandary that goes beyond the scope of this video. But with the benefit of hindsight, we can go through the Oscars year by year and find lots of instances where great movies and great performances were either underappreciated by the Oscars or overlooked entirely. You also begin to notice that a lot of movies up for these awards happen to be made by big-name studios, big-name directors, and big-name actors. Now let's come back to the Game Awards. Geoff Keighley has made it his life's work to recreate the Oscars for gaming. And so most of the problems with the Game Awards are problems that have been inherited from the Oscars. Favoring big names and big studios? That's an Oscars problem. Focusing on big name celebrities to bring in viewers? That's an Oscars problem. When you set out to make a Game Awards show that's modeled after the Oscars, you're basically saying, we are going to make a Game Awards show that helps the rich get richer. If you go back to my data in part 2, you'll remember that there are basically only 2 awards intended specifically to recognize independent games, and that basically every other award skews heavily towards top-end AAA developers. The only way to break through at the Game Awards as an independent developer is to make a game so transcendently good that the show cannot possibly ignore it. And even then, you're probably going to lose to a mediocre AAA game anyway. Just to give one example, I've had more fun playing Lethal Company with my friends than I've had playing any multiplayer game in years, but I didn't get any recognition for its multiplayer in last year's awards or this year's nominations. Instead, the best multiplayer nominations go to games like Mario Wonder and Diablo 4. Both solid games, but not really games you think of as doing anything new when it comes to multiplayer. Now, like I've said, this tilt towards big budget games ends up making the Game Awards kind of useless as an actual award show. But the other thing that makes it useless as an award show is the other thing we've been talking about, which is the fact that the show focuses less on awards for past games and more on marketing for future games.
There are lots more awards to come, but now it's time to look ahead to what you'll be playing next.
And I think that this is a reflection of Geoff's attitudes towards journalism generally. If you look over the articles that Geoff has written about games and other topics over the years, there is, in my opinion, a tendency for his coverage to be favorable. Geoff seems to like writing about people who are successful. When he writes features about games like Half-Life 2, he talks about how cool the developers were for overcoming adversity. When he writes about the Cirque du Soleil, he talks about how cool the show is and how brilliant all the business minds behind it are. Geoff has a degree in journalism, but throughout his whole career, he's walked the line between journalism and blogging. At this point in his career, the word I would use is promoter. The Game Awards is a show about promoting big-name developers for the games they've already made and the games they're going to make. And this also helps to promote Geoff's personal brand. Let's talk about Geoff's personal brand a little bit.
Oh my God, Jordan, welcome to the Game Awards.
Geoff created the Game Awards, and he hosts them every year. And because he created the Game Awards, you and I cannot stop him from doing this. But to go back to the Oscars analogy, who hosts the Oscars every year? Usually, it's someone who's had a successful career as a comedian and/or host, somebody who people want to tune in and see. And I say this without wishing to be mean to Geoff, but he definitely doesn't have that kind of star power for people outside gaming, and I'm not sure he has that star power for people inside gaming. A weirdly large amount of time at the Game Awards is spent on Geoff, either doing skits that aren't particularly funny or displaying him up on stage with celebrities, some of whom are his personal friends. I don't know what purpose these segments serve other than trying to show the world how cool Geoff is. I think it's also worth noting that one side effect of having a bunch of game reveals at the Game Awards is that way more people end up watching the show, which boosts the number of people who see Geoff rubbing elbows with celebrities. I'm going out on a limb here, but I have to assume that if Geoff was not in control of the Game Awards, and the show was just run by some random media company, that media company wouldn't be putting this stuff in the show. Is anybody other than Geoff Keighley dying to see Geoff Keighley do a skit with the Muppets every year? The Oscars do a different host every year because the Oscars aren't intended to grow the fame of the host of the Oscars. If you keep tabs on Geoff on Twitter, you see that his commitment to promotion is pretty wide-ranging. To quote one writer, "If the news isn't about something depressing, Keighley will share it." He fires off a bunch of tweets about how it's reasonable for the PS5 Pro to be $700. He fires off a bunch of tweets about how well popular games are selling. The only time Geoff gets close to being negative online is when he personally is getting embarrassed. As I was reading one article about Geoff, I came across this promotional tweet he put out about the new device which allegedly uses AI to add smells when you're playing a video game. The author of this article reached out to the company involved and discovered that they didn't even pay Geoff for this tweet. Geoff saw this thing and just chose to fire off what is basically a free ad for it to his huge Twitter following. And if Geoff really just likes viral tweets and promoting products, this is where the question of him being a journalist gets to be really troublesome. If Geoff's goal for his coverage is to provide a positive picture of products from major companies, then his media presence is only helpful to those companies and only unhelpful to people trying to make an informed decision about those products. And this is why I don't think there's really any hope for the Game Awards. So long as the guiding vision of the show is to create a show that is the Oscars plus advertisements plus displaying Geoff Keighley to the world, it's going to continue to be pretty worthless as a show for recognizing games. And that sucks, because there's already so little recognition for game developers to go around as it is. In any other industry awards show, whether or not you're someone famous in the eyes of the world, you at least get to be recognized by your peers and by the people who know you. But every developer who shows up to the Game Awards does so knowing that they are not the star of the show. The stars of the show are brands and trailers and Geoff Keighley. And the industry deserves better than that. If you like this video and want more videos like it, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. As a bonus, I've included my predictions for tomorrow night's Game Awards winners. So if you're watching this video right after it came out, come back in like 36 hours and watch it again to see how wrong my predictions end up being.